Today's gospel is from the book of Matthew, chapter 16, verses 13 through 20, and found in the New Testament on page 18 of your pew Bible if you'd like to follow. Now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, but others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah. For flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then he sternly ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. Thanks be to God.
I will never forget the day that he handed over the keys to me and said, "Okay, it's your turn." It's the kind of thing that children, especially sons, do not forget, that important rite of passage, the moment when your father decides to give to you the keys to the car and allows you to drive for the very first time. Now, I'm not talking about sitting in the lap, turning the wheel a touch while someone else works the pedals kind of driving. I'm talking about full-fledged, just got your learner's permit, you're in charge of the whole thing kind of driving. It was on a very faded country road, the kind of road that had not seen any kind of new asphalt in at least a dozen years. There was no center line to determine lanes because this road barely fit the legal definition of a two-lane road. There were neither yellow line or white lines to mark the boundaries of the shoulder because there was no shoulder to the road. Where the asphalt stopped, dirt and ditch began. The keys he handed me were to the truck, a 1973 Jeep AMC J-Series full-sized four-wheel drive truck with big off-road tires. Don't forget, I'm from Georgia. That's how we do our trucks. There was no power steering in the truck because the truck was made before there was power steering. There was less play in a kindergarten recess than there was in the steering wheel to my dad's truck. There was no power steering. That also meant there were no power brakes, which meant you also had to pay attention very closely because when you saw the sign going down the road which said "stop sign ahead," you better start pumping your brakes right then and there. As for the shock absorbers, I'm not so sure there were any. Bouncing with every piece of gravel and every crack and crevice in the road was just part of the experience of driving. And there were a few saving graces. One, it was an automatic transmission. Despite my father's insistence otherwise, he couldn't drive a manual transmission. Now, he always insisted that he knew how to. He just chose not to. I didn't buy it. Two, the color of the truck was a very bright teal blue-green. Again, the truck was manufactured in the 70s after all, so you could see it and you could hear it coming down the road for quite a while. And three, on the slim chance that you were ever in a wreck while driving the truck, anything short of a combine would not damage the truck. My dad had pulled the truck over to the side of the deserted road. He turned off the ignition and he tossed me the keys. I slid over into the drive behind the wheel. He got out, went around to the passenger side, got in the car, got in the truck, and he looked at me and he asked me, "So what are you going to do?" I cranked the truck. I pressed the gas as hard as I could to hear the engine rev. I went for the column, and I grabbed the stick to put the truck into drive, and I pressed the gas again as hard as I could, and I turned the wheel to get us from the dirt onto the asphalt, and we slammed to the back of the seat as I pulled away, and I was flying. Or so I thought. I was really doing about 20 miles an hour. "You need to speed up," he said, which was the first and only time anyone has ever needed to say that to me. So there I was driving. Hands on the wheel at 10 and 2, and we were bouncing around, and the wheel was going like this, and we were all straight, and I was a god. Until we met another car coming down the road. And immediately my 15-year-old brain, went into overload. Who is this person coming at us? Why are they here? No one is supposed to be on this road. Why are they driving on this road? No one ever uses this road. That is why we are here. What do I do? What do I do? What do I do? And I began to panic. And as the car meeting us got closer to us, I began to slow down. And by the time we had met, I just stopped. I just stopped my dad's truck right there in the middle of the road until the other car passed. Now, my dad, he never panicked, to his credit. He never panicked. He never yelled at me. He never asked, "What in the blankety blank are you doing?" He just said, "Yeah, you can't do that. Every time you meet another car coming at you, you can't just stop like that." And he was right. He was right. Whether it's another car or whether it's really anything else in life that seems like or feels like a potential threat, you can't just stop. You can't just panic, and you can't just freeze, and you can't just do something reckless like that. All of this just goes to show that just because you have the keys to something, it does not mean you know what to do. Just because you have the keys to something, that does not mean you know the fullness of whatever it is that those keys will do. Just because you have the keys to something, that does not mean that you get to use those keys to lock people out, or that you get to use those keys to lock the doors to keep other people from coming in. Just because you have the keys, it does not mean you know what to do. Just because you have the keys, it does not mean you know what you are doing. Peter, said Jesus, upon your confession, I'm going to build my church, and I'm going to toss to you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. And Peter responded, "What's a church?" Don't worry, said Jesus. With the keys to the kingdom of heaven, not even the gates of hell will prevail over you. But I don't know how to drive, Peter protested again. You will learn, said Jesus. You will learn. You have been learning already. Don't you understand? All this time I have been teaching you about the kingdom of heaven, Peter. Don't you remember? Don't you remember, Peter, that the kingdom of heaven, it's come near? Don't you remember, Peter, the kingdom of heaven, it's like a mustard seed that someone took and sowed it into their field? Don't you remember, Peter, that the kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed it in with 3 measures of flour until all of it was leavened? Don't you remember, Peter, that the kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field, which someone then found and hid, and then in all of his joy, he goes and he sells all that he has so that he can buy that field. Don't you remember, Peter, that the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls? Don't you remember, Peter, that the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was thrown into the sea and caught fish of all kinds? Don't you remember, Peter? Don't you remember that the kingdom of heaven belongs to the poor in spirit? Don't you remember, Peter, that the kingdom of heaven belongs to those who are persecuted in the name of righteousness? Don't you remember, Peter, that the kingdom of heaven belongs to those who hunger and thirst for righteousness? Don't you remember, Peter, that the kingdom of heaven belongs to the merciful? Don't you remember, Peter, that the kingdom of heaven belongs to the pure in heart? Don't you remember, Peter, the kingdom of heaven belongs to the peacemakers? Peter, said Jesus, do you not hear me? Do you not understand me? What I have said to you. Hell has gates, but the kingdom of heaven has no borders. Peter, said Jesus, let me tell you a story. When I was a baby, my mom and my dad fled our home in Judea because King Herod was mean and ruthless and paranoid and oppressive and evil, and we migrated from Judea to another country over to Egypt to get away from ruthlessness and oppression. And do you know what Herod did? Jesus asked Peter. He separated children from their mothers, and then he killed the children. Don't you remember, Peter, that the kingdom of heaven belongs to the meek, like those little children separated from their mothers? Don't you remember, Peter, that the kingdom of heaven belongs to those who mourn, like those mothers who have had their children taken away from them? 10 years ago, 2008, I was serving a congregation in downtown Athens, Georgia, First Christian Church. Because it was 2008, it was an election year. And you may remember that one of the candidates that year was from a border state. And so the topic of immigration was very much in the forefront of our national conversation. I was serving that congregation, and right on the other corner from us was St. Joseph's Catholic Church. Now, Athens, Georgia does not have a large Catholic population, and St. Joseph's Catholic Church was the Catholic parish in the city of Athens. Now, the University of Georgia had on its campus a campus ministry for the Catholics, but St. Joseph's was the Catholic parish. It was an older parish. It represented older Athens, if you will. And it was, because it was an older parish, it was beginning to diminish in its size. But an amazing thing was also happening at that time, because in Athens there was this incredible increase of Latino men and women and children. And they all began to go to St. Joseph's Catholic Church. And so St. Joseph's Catholic Church hired and called an associate priest who was Latino. They essentially had two congregations. They had two separate masses, one in English, one in Spanish. One led by the head priest, the other led by the associate priest. One day I was standing in my office and the associate priest came to see me. He said, "Pastor," he said, "in a few weeks from now, we are going to be hosting at St. Joseph's a celebration, a rally. And it is on the issue of immigration, and I would just like to know, would it be possible for us to use your parking lot as overflow?" They had a school there. It was going to be during the afternoon. There was some traffic concerns. So they just wanted to use the parking lot of First Christian Church Athens for overflow. I looked at the calendar. We had nothing. I said, sure. Jump forward about 3 or 4 weeks. It was that Monday morning, the day of their rally, when we were to have overflow parking. At that time, on every Monday morning, I would arise at 4 a.m. and go to the grocery store and buy breakfast food, eggs, bacon, biscuits, and fruit, and all kinds of stuff, because at 7:30 a.m. we had a prayer breakfast. I would get up and I would cook breakfast for about 8 to 10 to 12 people, and we would have breakfast together, and we would pray together, and we would be done by 8 o'clock so everybody could go to work. So I would get to the church around 5:15, 5:30 to start cooking. I turned on the radio so I could listen, and about that time the news came on, and the news said, "Today at First Christian Church in Athens, Georgia, there will be an immigration rally being held there." And I said, "What?" And about that time, my phone began to blow up with emails. People began trickling in. I began to get questions. "So, I read in the paper today that we're hosting an immigration rally. Did you know anything about it?" "No, I didn't. Here's what I do know. We're supposed to be using our parking lot for overflow. I'll find out what's going on." The office at St. Joseph's opened at 9 o'clock. At 9 o'clock and 15 seconds, I was at the door of St. Joseph Catholic Church wanting to speak to the associate priest. Guess what? He wasn't available. But the head priest was. And yet they had an interim. He was from Ireland. And he spoke with a thick Irish accent that was very hard to understand. That was a bad, I know, but it's still. My wife from Scotland just shuddered. But still. And I told him what was going on. I said, we were just supposed to be overflow. And he kind of chuckled. He said, "I'll take care of that." Within 30 minutes, the associate priest was at my door and in my office apologizing. He knew what he had done. The plan all along was not for it to be held at St. Joseph's, but for it to be at First Christian Church. He just didn't tell me what was going to happen. There was nothing I could do. It was all in the news. It was all in the media. Everybody knew. They were expecting hundreds of people to come. Porta potties had been ordered. Stages had been ordered. Sound systems had been ordered. This was going to be a big deal, and I found out about it that morning. Of course, I immediately called my board chair, set things right there, said I had no idea. I sent an email to the entire congregation saying that this was happening. I'm sorry, this is what I was told, but this is happening here. And I assured the congregation that I would stay and be present the entire time, and I would not leave until everything was done and gone and cleaned up. By the way, I want to point out that the paper the very next day said, "First Presbyterian Church of Athens hosts immigration rally," which just goes to show no good deed goes unpunished. We couldn't even get credit for something we didn't know we were going to do, but that we ended up doing. The rally came, it took place, they had speakers, they had music, people were excited. I was even asked, someone came to me and said, "Do you want to speak?" I was like, "No, I do not want to speak. I want this day to end as quickly as possible." it ended at 5 o'clock with a march from our church to Athens City Hall. They quickly cleaned up everything. The porta potties were taken away, the stages were broken down and hauled off, and everything was over. And I had been received a great deal of thanks that I didn't deserve, and I wasn't really sure at the time that I wanted, to be perfectly honest with you. Everything was spotless, and I was standing there by myself, I thought, in the parking lot of the church. And about that time, a little boy came up to me. He was about that tall. He probably wasn't any older than Lillian and probably wasn't any taller than she is. And he just looked up at me. And he started talking to me in Spanish and in broken toddler English. And I couldn't understand what he was saying. And finally, his mother and father, I don't know from where they came, but they came up to me and they looked at me and said, he needs to use the restroom. Is there a place that he can go to the bathroom? And I said, sure, come with me. And so we all went in to the church. And I showed them where the restroom was. And I said to the mother and father, look, I said, I need to make sure everything is still cleaned up. This is the way out. The door will close right behind you. When y'all are done, just come on out and everything will be fine. They said, thank you. That's great. We will make sure. We were just coming in and go right out. So I walked away. And I began doing what I thought I needed to do, was to make sure that everything around the church was locked and closed and cleaned up. About 10 minutes later, I'm walking, and I come around the corner of the church, and I'm on the sidewalk, and the church is to my left, to my right, and Pulaski Street, Doherty Street is here, Prince Avenue and Doherty Street here are on my left, and I know that doesn't mean anything to you, but that's where they were. And I'm walking to the corner, and in my peripheral vision, I see a car going very slowly. And I hear this voice, a familiar voice, and it simply just says, thank you. Thank you. And it was that little boy who just went to the bathroom. And he was in the back seat of the car, and half his body was hanging out of the car. And he was just waving and smiling and saying thank you. Now that was 10 years ago. That was 10 years ago. And on that day, I learned a valuable lesson. I learned that day that the kingdom of heaven of God, does not care about process or plans or policy or law, except for the law of love. Except for the law of love. You know what? I don't pretend to have all the answers to the problems that we face as a world. Now, like you, I have a lot of opinions. I have a lot of opinions, and I also have hopes. I have hopes for the problems that we face. And my hopes are born out of my understanding of who I believe God is. And my hopes are formed out of what I believe God is. And my hopes are formed out of who and what I believe God calls us to be as people, as faithful children of God. See, as a person of faith, as one who has made myself a profession of faith, not unlike the one Peter made at Caesarea Philippi, that is the lens through which I view everything in this world. That is the lens through which I view all of our world's problems. That is the lens through which I view all of its possible solutions. That is the lens through which I view and create all of my opinions. That is the lens through which I create and place upon all of my hopes. You know, it's not many verses later in the presence of Peter that Jesus and the rest of his disciples that Jesus is going to say, look, as he grabs a child, as he takes a child and brings that child to the forefront of his teaching, he says, look, unless you change and become like one of these children right here. Unless you change and become like one of these children here, I don't care what kind of keys you have, you will never see the kingdom of heaven. I don't care what kind of keys you have, says Jesus. Whoever humbles themselves like a child will be greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And whoever welcomes a child welcomes me. And I don't care what kind of keys you have. But if you do not welcome that child, then you are not welcoming me. And woe to those, says Jesus. Woe to those who put any kind of stumbling block in front of a child. Woe be to them. It would be better if they had a boulder tied around their neck and then they were thrown into the Mississippi River. Now, that's not me saying that. That's Jesus. And right now, down in Texas, there are 2,200 children who have no idea where their mamas and where their daddies are because they fled Herod and they came to another country and they are locked up right now behind the gates of hell. But guess what? Hell has gates, but the kingdom of heaven has no borders. And those of us who call ourselves Christian, who profess, like Peter, that Jesus is Lord, that Jesus is Messiah, we have been handed over the keys that set them free.